This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us once again the inimitable Dr. Buck Melton. Nice to have you with us tonight, Buck.
I could announce that I'm available for speaker, but I think Pelosi is going to get it.
Well, I see a bigger role for you in America, Buck, than that of being Speaker of the House. Maybe occupying a position at the White House. But let us.
Speaking of White House,
well, let's springboard into that now. I mean, and probably one of the most interesting phenomena we've had in the political spectrum is President Trump, and I guess it was a little bit like handling kryptonite. If he hears us say anything negative, we might not be fired. I guess. I mean, whatever. But I think we'll be neutral in trying to discuss his good points and bad points.
But haven't you ever wanted to be the subject of a Twitter?
Yeah, he's probably up there watching us now in the White House. I don't doubt his operatives are out there. You know, many people are there. But it's a really interesting story, isn't it? And I'll start off by asking the question: is one of the things that makes this so interesting is that he never had any political role ever. He never went through any of the vetting that happens when you're a politician, and dare I say, compromises. So he just walked into the most powerful position in the world, one could say, just did it without any political work earlier. I mean, without going through the tedious arrangements that politicians have to do, fundraising money, going back and forth, trying to adhere to the limits of behavior that are imposed in politics. Is there ever been a president that just spontaneously went into the White House with no other political office? Anyone else?
The closest that occurs to me would be Andrew Jackson. I mean, I suppose you could throw Warren Harding out there, and that was a disaster. But even these men had some background. Jackson had had a lot of experience at the state level.
Right.
He had been a U.S. senator. But he did come essentially out of nowhere, based on his character, based on his image,
yes.
As opposed to based on his climbing the ladder and gaining the political experience.
Right.
So,
and I think actually President Trump has a picture of Andrew Jackson in his office, in the Oval Office, and he's sort of, I would imagine, sees himself in that role. Andrew Jackson was vilified by the Washington establishment and did these things that he just fought with everybody. And then one could say, even now, there's some good pros and cons about him, but
many more cons than pros. I don't think.
Not formally. Yes. So that reflects the change in the country. So, at least when I was a young boy, I mean, he was a well-regarded person, and the Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners in the Democratic Party.
Yes.
So. Many towns that are named after Jackson, Jacksonville, Jackson, Georgia, sundry everywhere, Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson's everywhere.
Yes.
However, maybe just continuing along those lines, there have been a number of presidents that just sort of went in for the military. So we have Dwight D. Eisenhower would be such a person. I mean, maybe Zachary Taylor. There have been people that have just gone in with no political experience, but they had substantial military experience, which is a different kind of mindset. But particularly with Eisenhower, there were so many political responsibilities that he had to handle in his position.
Administrative.
He running a large administration, and there also was sort of a type of conduct and appearance that would be necessary in the military that President Trump did not have to go through.
Well, it depends. For instance, if you take if we'll take World War II as an example, you could name Bill Halsey, Douglas MacArthur, God help us, Patton. If these would not have been presidential material. On the other hand, if you take George Marshall or Eisenhower, who were not well known for being battlefield commanders, but who were the administrator geniuses. And of course, Marshall became Secretary of State. I think you're onto something there.
Yes, but so I guess the point I'm making is the way that Donald Trump became president. He's a very singular, I guess, path toward that position. So it a very, very unusual way to become president, and almost miraculous, if you want to say that, as to how that has happened. And now that we can say sort of an unusual personality, can we parse out some of his bad points? Do we have any? Is that going to be hard to do? I hope, Donald, you're not taking offense if you happen to be listening in, which you often do, or any of your minions. But what are some of it?
Well, I think,
and by the way,
yes.
If one said this, he would be very, he would really be furious.
Yes. Well,
is that correct? If people were just saying, let's
yes.
talk about your bad qualities.
Well, I think most of the, not all, but I think most of the bad points, you'd argue, eye of the beholder. He's direct to the point of being abrasive and brusque. But if you look at why presumably he was elected, it was by people who wanted straight talk and
yes.
not mealy-mouthed politicians.
Yes.
Obviously, he's crude. Well, we've had very crude presidents before. They've just been crude, usually, well, in an age before a time when microphones and cameras were everywhere.
Yes.
Nixon was not the first person to tape Oval Office conversations.
Yes.
John F. Kennedy said some very crude things,
Right.
a lot
yes.
of sexual
yes.
innuendo.
Yes.
Nixon himself was very profane.
Yes.
That we get. So yeah, even that is not new.
Well, let's pursue that a little bit.
Yes.
So, are we going to assert that let's see all the coarseness that comes across just everywhere, that it was present earlier, but disguised? In other words, his enemies are this is like a normal Washington figure. This is the way politicians are. However, people take care not to let this happen.
Yes.
But there's this huge, I guess, group of people that are just opposed to him to the nth degree, that constantly are trying to publicize some of his, lack of genteel behavior.
Yes. And I think you've got two groups in the main who take exception to the fact that we've elected Trump. I remember, I must say as an aside, that in Obama's last congressional midterm, which would have been, 2014, George Will wrote the next day when the Republicans won big in Congress, "The people have spoken, the blankety blanks."
Right.
So I think that's how a lot of people view Trump. He was legitimately elected, and the Democrats are aghast at that, and the Republican establishment is equally aghast. And I think that latter point is one reason, one of many, why Trump does not have much of a legislative legacy during his first 2 years. And now that the Democrats have the House, there isn't going to be a legislative legacy from here on out unless he shows really an unparalleled ability to work across the aisle. He's not even been able to work with his own party.
Yes.
So.
Well, now, is this extreme path through a person that would not normally be in this position, just happens to be there? So the normal, I guess, way that things are done in politics is that there's a lot of, compromise, fellowship, and you would be, you'd say, you can have this, you can have that, in a very soft way, and you would not be assertive in your arguments. To a degree, you'd be restrained. Well, you wouldn't call someone short, for instance, or whatever other things, or castigate them. You wouldn't. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'll give you a big exception, one that I should have mentioned before. LBJ.
Yes.
Now Johnson, I think, was probably just as crude, just as rough around the edges as Trump. Although once again the mics weren't there as often for him. But he's an example of how a very crude, very base, very profane individual could also be an extraordinarily capable log roller, compromiser, politician. He could play both as president and as a member of Congress. He played the game. He was a master. He was a boss. So
in looking at this situation, the extreme, let's say the extreme parts of Trump's behavior have some kind of higher purpose. Mm-hmm. Just to ask that question, and then we're sailing a little bit into some of his good points here. So is there an argument that this atypical kind of behavior does a few things? Number one, you can be profane after people accept that you are. So maybe a lot of times what happens with scandal or whatever, a person that is presumably a moral, church-going, I don't know, whatever it is, deacon of the church, falls into error in some way. I mean, with a chorus girl, whatever, briefly or whatever. I mean, and everyone finds out about this alleged pure person's relationship with a chorus girl, and that's the end of the person. Yes. But so much is in there with Trump. I mean, you can't imagine anything that could. There's never a pretense that he was the church deacon ever. So people just accept the idea that, well, he's having some kind of tiff with porn stars, and he has these rascally lawyers that are around him, and he did that, and he is some way that he's he's extracting money in some dubious way, and all of these accusations and charges and that have been tossed at him, it bounces off a bit because of his persona. And is ultimately what's going to happen here? Is this going to be a whole nother real politic kind of way that all these great deeds are accomplished by the art of the deal, extreme positions and then compromise? So whatever happened with NAFTA, I'm not sure anything did happen incidentally, but whatever has happened, whatever is going on with China, whatever threaten Venezuela, I mean, do this, build the wall, all these extreme things that have been, well, I don't know if the wall is extreme, but in any event, ideas that in many circles are extreme are put out, and that in the end, all these things are accomplished. It turns out the art of the deal is he's the master of this, coming out of the real tough environment of the Bronx real estate game, which I'm sure would curl my toes trying to do. Well, I mean, is this a virtue that he has, all of this extreme behavior?
Well, we have to ask. I think taking that kind of behavior, how much has he achieved? The really big thing that he argued for, and probably the thing that put him over the top, was the wall. And I don't see a wall, and he keeps on signing budget legislation that prevents him from building the wall. So, he talked a good game, but is he good at following through? And I'm not sure I'm seeing a lot of that.
Well, can we get, now I'm finally getting to some of the another sort of twist in the story, is that the visceral hatred that in many circles that people have against Trump, is that preventing a reasonable assessment of what's going on here?
Oh, I think so.
They're just reading the New York Times. It's just article after article about some new discovery, some new shortcoming. And the question to be asked is, and I think a fair question is, why has there been such besides maybe his personal qualities, why has there been such a terrific reaction against Trump? And is there such a thing as the deep state? And is there a mechanism in the country that is its purpose is to drive the country in a certain direction, and the people are committed to this. Many of them are bureaucrats. They're part of religion. They're part of all kinds of foundations. If you could say if there is an American establishment, you might say there is an establishment that is taking the country on a different path that many people imagined it would go. So if you looked at people that, let's say if you know people, and you may or may have known them, people that were fought at Normandy or whatever, all the great sacrifices they made, many of them, I could say, males of European descent that did all these things. And this is the way the country, I imagine the country is going to be, kind of a Thomas Jefferson, some kind of nationalist. You know, you could even say that their purpose was American nationalism, which could be written as exceptionalism, which could be written as the world's lifeboat. I mean, a special kind of responsibilities, all these good things that, at least at one time, were presented as American destiny. And people, many people would think, this is too exclusive. This is not fair. This is elitism. We just don't want this kind of country. And we're going, all right. And Trump is saying, this is a populist view, yes, this is the kind of country that people want. I'm going to get there, and that's caused the problem.
Well, it's a showdown between globalism or internationalism on the one hand and nationalism. And internationalism has really been in the ascendancy, I'd say, for the last 20 to 30 years. I mean, I think the last unabashed nationalist that we had in the White House was probably Reagan. And so we've been due for another round of it. And I think Trump really clearly comes down in the nationalism category, but he doesn't fully understand that yet. He sounded like a protectionist when he was campaigning. Then when he became inaugurated, he was free trade, and then suddenly protectionist again. And now, as we record this, he's back down on that, and the China tariffs are now a thing of the past. So I don't know where we go next. I don't think he has a clear, well thought out worldview.
Well, yes. And, one can question his grounding in sort of, deep principles. And he's obviously pretty good as a real estate speculator, maybe. I mean, and it's, casinos.
He's apparently lost a lot of money, too.
Actually, no one really knows what's going on here. And there may be a substantial smoke and mirrors arrangement with his wealth. Who can say?
Yes.
Maybe not. But he's obviously a very narcissistic person. But then what politician is not? You couldn't be a president. You probably could not be a politician without a substantial degree of narcissism.
Yes. What was Groucho's line? I would not want to be a member of any club that would have me.
Right.
It's sort of the same thing. I fundamentally, at a very deep level, distrust any politician who wants to be a politician because he's got the wrong motivation. So we've discussed this before. I think that people ought to be drafted. I'm not.
Yes.
Not me now. If you take somebody who has the requisite experience, requirements, intelligence, civic mindedness, and make him be an elected official for a few years. And I think that the country is probably safer with someone like that.
Well, you could make the case even that the whole nomination process could be done differently. Yes. And so maybe the idea of having all these primaries is letting I guess people that can secure a lot of money and have an establishment put there, and that would be the person that might do to be able to manipulate the public, I guess you'd say, that have the resources to do that, either by being an extreme personality on television or being a long-standing politician with access to money and funds and on and on. Well, I mean, you could say that it might work better in the smoke-filled rooms if one can't speculate on this, but would the parties pick, if they just got among themselves and they said, let's nominate Woodrow Wilson as president. I mean, he's a great person and on, or actually, I don't know if they would or would not. I think Warren Harding came out of this, but yes. I mean, I don't know, but that would be an issue about getting leaders in there.
Well, that's what we had before the aforementioned Andrew Jackson. That the party bigwigs, party caucuses, chose our presidents. We had the Virginia dynasty,
yes.
In which every president prior to Jackson was either a Virginian or an Adams, either
yes,
John Adams or John Quincy.
Yes.
And in the main, they were good presidents. And then we got Jackson, who is a fascinating character. He's one of those interesting people to read about. But practically every one of the policies he backed as president was disastrous.
Yes.
So and yet the policy, the process we chose of nominating Jackson, it changed American politics forever, and I would argue not necessarily for the better.
Yes, yes. Well, we have those issues with getting back to Trump a little bit, and politically correct thought, and it's almost another card in the deck here. I mean, we could say what sort of leader he is or what he isn't, but I think there is the idea of, we have the term voter suppression is also voter manipulation, if I could say that. So there is this sort of idea that the power structure in the country is manipulating your situation. The bureaucrats are propagating rules, there are ways you behave, and so gradually the sense of American freedom has been diminished, or your ability to behave in the ways you might have behaved in the past is being restricted and restricted and restricted. And then Trump is saying, let's do this, let's do that, and there are big cheers. And it's also true that when, maybe this is a normal thing for politicians, when he appears, he's draped in the American flags, and in his speeches, he said, it's sort of an America first. And I pursue this, I want to just touch on this point a little bit. Internationalism versus the nation state. We talked about it before, but to quote Samuel Johnson, the last refuge of a scoundrel is patriotism. So in a way, if you wish to manipulate people or seize the high ground, you can just claim, I'm a better American than you are, and I'll wrap myself in the American flag, and this is, I don't know, Valley's Forge Remembrance Day, or you could do that. And particularly for the new Americans that it's hard, not necessarily, but in a way it's more difficult to go there slightly. I mean, there's a sense of, when a person like Trump is wrapping themselves in the American flag, there's a little sense of exclusion, I think, for a person looking at that, particularly a person coming into the country and illegally, or however you want to say that. I think about over 10% of the inhabitants of the country are overseas, and I don't think we particularly have this statistic. But the extraordinary number of people that are dual citizens, it's an incredible number. I mean, and it's very, in a way, corrosive to the nation state.
Yes.
Now, maybe, and this is a really big question to ask, is it good for America to be a traditional nation state, or is it better for it to be sort of an amalgam of civilization? So we don't really have any borders, we don't really have any citizenship. It's this wonderful economic zone, and we have these qualities that make it interesting, particularly for people from some other country. So if you come to America and you're bright and you're whatever, you're going to just do great compared to wherever you're from. Otherwise, all the doors are open, and you could never, I don't know, do whatever you can do here if you lived in South Sudan or Poland or wherever. There are great opportunities, and you don't even have to surrender your passport. And you can do things worldwide, and the power that's being generated by the world in the 21st century makes a nation state an outdated concept.
Yes.
And just to go through that, if you try and become a rigid nation state, the marketplace will punish you. The marketplace of ideas will punish you, and you'll gradually just be marginalized. And so, is there an argument to not be a nation state?
Well, I mean, there are certainly interests that are not limited to only one nation state, only one geographic region. There are some interests that really are the common interest of mankind. And the thing that immediately comes to mind for me is the environment. Mm-hmm. That no one country, no matter how big, no matter how powerful, can possibly take on the environmental crisis, which I firmly believe we're in, by itself. You have to have concerted action for that. On the other hand, if you talk about mores, if you talk about values, I think most sane people would say, there are some ideas, there are some values, there are some principles that are more beneficial, more important, more valuable than others. And I suppose theoretically you could adopt Melton's argument, whoever knew truth to be put to the worse in a free and open encounter. But as we have seen in the totalitarian movements of the 20th century, a lot of times there's not going to be a free and open encounter. There's going to be subterfuge, there's going to be subversion of the system. So maybe the better ideas, the idea, for instance, that we talked about in our previous episode, critical thought, values of republicanism, actually do need some protection against those who would seek to destroy them for their own ends.
Well, let's keep at this. I mean, I was trying to lure you into, I guess, supporting nation states. Maybe you did, but
I think to a degree I did.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. I think you did. Maybe
I don't
in
mind.
a backhanded way. Okay.
I think people ought to be free to come here to contribute to us to make us better, but
right.
they need to accept the ground rules of the system.
Well, here's what's going on, I think, in whatever nation state is. So maybe I've made these points before. So a nation to me would mean you've got a shared history, you've got cultural connections, and in many ways a similar genetic structure, a similar appearance in 1,000 years of history or 2,000. And the U.S., by its definition and position, cannot be a nation. I know that sounds slightly whatever it is. It can be a state. So the state can put regulations, and there can be some kind of sense of almost American religion. You can join the church, and then you do have an American church that could exist with moral behavior, and it can be a country. However, if this is weakened by many factors, it's going to be very difficult to maintain that. And I'll sort of close my comments here. I think certainly Christianity or whatever is hardly a national thing. I mean, I think that's fair. I think the whole issue of speaking one language is whatever it is. Certainly, one ethnic group is just all that's gone. I mentioned dual citizenships. And then cultural ideas that obviate traditional American values, I think are on the decline. And then finally, I'll say this: if in fact the nation state were destroyed, you could have the America itself as keeping its identity goes away. The obvious successor to this would be China. I mean, it seems to me that China is set up for world domination in a one world arrangement for many reasons, which we can talk about at another point. Well, okay, Bucky, good interchange tonight. All right, we'll have some more. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.